would put away the cost of. Yeah. I mean, I would replace.
Okay, you're missing. But I guess it's 10 minutes, so we'll go ahead. Okay, so today we're talking about interviews and focus groups and experiments, which are two very different topics. We're going to start with experiments, and then we're going to move on to interviews and focus groups for the second half of the class, which is what our student group is going to present. So we'll talk about the Dr. Horowitz article in the first half. After we do a little bit of a in-class experiment workshop, which is basically just getting started. Just want to, experiments are a lot. And I will say that if you're going to use this method in the future, it's likely that you're going to be taking another class at Inls that's going to go into experiments in a lot more depth. So if you're on the IS side and you might be doing something like UX experiments or HCI experiments, you're going to cover those details in a different class. So we're just skimming the surface today, like we do with most methods. I think with experiments, probably even more than usual because it is covered elsewhere in our curriculum, if you need it. Okay, so as a reminder, experiments are definitely very firmly in the quantitative positivist philosophical arena, right? This is not. This is where we're using terms like reliability, validity, we're talking about objectivity. The researcher is trying to remain separate. All of those sort of classic things that we think about when we think about scientific methods apply here. Not so much in the other forms of research that we're talking about. It's a very old form of research, and the focus is typically on trying to find either a correlational or kind of the big goal, perhaps trying to establish a causal relationship between two or more variables. And since that's our goal, experiments need to involve a really high degree of control over the environment because you're only trying to test the two or more variables that you are interested in. The goal is to try to control everything else, which is difficult because especially when you're doing experiments with humans, and to like control, we don't do very well with it. Humans are difficult to fully control. Our environments are difficult to control. And also, when you try to control all of these extra things, what it means is that you're going to sacrifice what's called ecological validity. Most experiments that we do are done in a lab setting, and there's really no guarantee that people are going to behave the same in that lab setting as they would outside in the real world. Even when we try to do experiments in the real world, in vivo experiments, often we're doing them with sort of falsely set up or artificial prompts to people. And again, they may or may not react the same to those artificial prompts as they would to a real need that comes from them. So it's really hard to do these well. Not to say that you can't do them at all or that they will give you good information. But there's a lot to think about when you do experiments. So I mentioned in the lecture that they have these these always remind me of those football coach diagrams with the X's and O's running all over the place. But there's basically only three letters that you need to worry about. R is randomization. O is your observation. So that could be a literal observation. You could mark down that someone's doing something, or more often it's a test of some sort. So observation could be, in this case, a pretest. The X is your intervention. And then usually you have more than one observation, so we're just denoted by numbers here. So I did want to point out that this is a place where people get confused. That R that's in your experimental diagrams is not the same as random sampling. It has nothing to do with random sampling. All it means is that you randomly assigned all of your participants into one of your experimental groups. So I could randomly assign each of you to either an experimental or control group, but if I did that, I still would have a convenient sample. So they're not necessarily related. And I can have a true experiment, even if I just pulled people off the street. So sampling concerns still play a role, but they're a separate step from how you design the experiment itself. Does that make sense for a second? We're going to see some examples. Okay, so I just want to talk through this general scenario, and we're gonna look at a few different twists or spins on this, and I think that it'll make it more clear the different types of experimental designs that are possible. So the general idea is that you work at the UNC Biochem Library, and you've been asked to develop a collection of LibGuides or pathfinders, basically resource lists, for each unit of UNC's introductory bio course, which has an enrollment of like 400 students each semester. It's one of these huge lecture-based classes. That's the general scenario, and then individual scenarios are going to give you some more. So the first scenario is that you can imagine that the course has two sections. So one meets Monday, Wednesday, one meets Tuesday, Thursday. So one really easy option there, if you want to test the impact of these pathfinders, you have these two already naturally occurring groups, is you could give the pathfinders to the students that are in, say, the Monday, Wednesday section, and not offer them to the Tuesday, Thursday. And your research question might be something like, do students in the course section using the pathfinders exhibit greater learning gains than students in the course section that do not use the pathfinders? Now, if I say learning gains, what does that mean for my experimental design? If I want to measure a gain, what do I have to do? Get a very small one. Yeah, I've got to have at least two measures, right? I have to see where they started from and then where they ended up. So this is kind of a classic experiment. The only thing that's missing from the first example that I showed you, does anyone see right away what letter is missing there? R. The R. So why is the R missing?
Your students were already in different classes, they weren't ready to learn.
Yeah, because I can't, as a librarian, I can't control which students sign up for the Monday, Wednesday section versus Tuesday, Thursday side. I don't have the option to randomize. So these are naturally occurring groups. What are some potential problems with that for my experiment?
Are we assuming that they have the same professor?
That's one potential problem. Maybe they don't, or maybe they have different TAs. Yeah, it's going to add a lot more variation than we would ideally want, sort of across the board. Maybe one of them is offered at 8 a.m. and the other one's offered in the afternoon. Maybe one of them conflicts with athletics practice, so all the athletes are enrolled in one section. By the way, that is not a knock on athletes. They have tutors that do better than students at large. But there are a lot of different factors that might make these two groups unequivalent in really meaningful ways. So one way that we can try to deal with that is by doing this pretest. If our group 101 and group 201 numbers are really close to each other, then that would maybe lessen our concern about having two really different groups. But that still doesn't account for things like different professors, different teaching styles, different times of the day, right? All it means is that they probably started around the same level of knowledge. So this is maybe the best that we could do with that scenario, but it's definitely not great. Does anyone want to take a stab at whether this is a between or within subjects design? Anyone even remember that from the lecture? Okay, go on. The only real difference, or the real difference, is that between subjects designs compare different groups. So individuals in group 1 would experience a different thing than individuals in group 2, and you're comparing results across groups. That's this. Within subjects design, all subjects would have the exact same treatment, maybe in a different order, but they would have the same treatment. So this is between, where you're measuring one group versus another. That's more standard. Yeah.
Did you say that the example from today was a within subject design with the libraries?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So we'll look at that one more closely when we talk about it. All right. So we talked about this. We can't consider these two groups to be equivalent, even if they have the exact same O1 score. If you could say, okay, well, let's say that the best possible scenario happened. The two sections were offered at the same time and they had the same professor and the same general set of TAs. If you could control as much of that as possible, then what two numbers would you want to compare to see whether the pathfinders had worked? In our diagram here. Which ones would you be looking at primarily?
We'd be looking at the second observation.
Yeah, you'd be looking over here. And again, this is assuming that the O1s were roughly the same. But what you'd want to see is that group 1, O2, is higher than group 2, O2. Another way you could do it is subtract O1 from O2 in each case and see which one hopefully grew. Hopefully nobody's losing knowledge over the course of the semester, but you could just look at the broad difference and you would expect to see, we would hope to see a bigger gain in group 1. So the problem, there are enough problems with this design that even if you did see that, you couldn't really be super sure that the difference was due to your pathfinders, right? Because there's lots of other things that it could be. And if students in the Tuesday, Thursday class talk to students in the Monday, Wednesday class, which is quite possible, there may be what's called design contamination, where they're like, hey, why are you getting these things and we're not? Can you send me those links? Or they might just go to the library website and find them. So this is not by any means a perfect experiment. Not terrible. What if we only had final exam scores and the course did not offer any sort of pretest?
And the results end up being pretty meaningless.
Yeah, this is really bad. You really can't tell anything from this. This is technically an experimental design or quasi-experimental design, but you really can't tell. You have no evidence to show that these groups started out anywhere near the same place. This is not good. All right, let's think about a different scenario now. If the course was divided into 14 one-week units, which most of them are, at the end of each unit, students take a 10-item multiple choice assessment. So basically, let's say they do the Monday, Wednesday class. Last 10 minutes of every Wednesday is reserved for a 10-minute quiz. So in this scenario, you decide to link the pathfinders from the Sakai site only for the last 7 units of the class. So you have data from week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, week 5, week 6, week 7. And then you start giving the pathfinders. And every week thereafter, the students would also have those. So what you want to see in that scenario is, do students' scores on the weekly assessments improve after you integrate the pathfinders? If you diagram that, it would look something like this. These are kind of weird diagrams because you have so many observations. But this is called a time series design. You don't need to remember that. It's a within subjects design because all of the students in this case would be experiencing the exact same experimental conditions. So you would observe them 7 times, and then you would input the pathfinders, and then you would observe them 7 more times. And you could, if you wanted to, put another X, which is indicating a new pathfinder, but the point remains the same, that this is where it starts. So what would you be looking for here if you wanted to see that the pathfinders have been successful?
Okay. You would be comparing the scores after the Pathfinder intervention to the ones before.
Yes. Now, is it likely that that there's some variation just naturally occurring over the course of the semester? Absolutely, right? So it could be that maybe week 4 was particularly hard and students' scores dropped that week. Or maybe this was the week right before spring break, so nobody was paying attention and scores dropped that week. Or maybe just the students are learning and getting better at taking the test, and so the scores are generally kind of going up over time. So if you graph it, you might have dots for scores that look something like that. 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7. All right, and here you're going to put in your path. So you can see if I was trying to draw a line through these, it's sloping up a little, but not like a lot. What you would hope to see after that is that scores kind of on average are higher, and you might also hope to see a better slope of the scores, that not only are they still improved. So the time series design is aptly named because it allows you to see that those trends over time. Usually when you do a time series, you would have like dozens or even hundreds of observations before you do your implementation. So one example of study that I've read was the impact of police body cams. So they looked at citizen complaints of excessive force, and they had tons of data points from large police departments over the long period of time. And then the implementation of the body cams, and then they looked at the same data for like a year after that happened. So it allows you to see seasonal changes, whereas if you just cherry pick like, oh, I'm going to do the 2 weeks before the body cams were impacted and the 2 weeks after, that doesn't give you a long enough window of time because maybe they were implemented on January 1st and the previous 2 weeks were a holiday, right? And maybe things were lower just in general. So this really allows you, it's really more meant for long. A library-specific example might be something like library traffic before and after a makerspace is into your library. So you wouldn't want to do it just the 2 weeks before and 2 weeks after because it's new and people might be excited and they come, but then maybe it drops off after that. Okay, this is not a true experiment because it doesn't have a control group. So this would be considered another quasi experiment. All right, last one. Let's say that you do have the ability to display the Pathfinder links on individual student Sakai sites, and you can randomly select 200 out of the 400 students. You only give the Pathfinders to those. Same question as before, or as in scenario one, the students who get the Pathfinders have greater learning gains. So this would be diagrammed the same, except this time we do have the R. So this time, if I saw that O1s were roughly the same, and I saw that group 1 O2 was a lot higher than group 2 O2, could I conclude that it was Pathfinders that made it? You think we would?
Yeah.
You would have a lot better evidence, at least, right? Because you're controlling for all of those other factors like different TAs, different times of day, athletes in one section versus another. Even the design contamination a little bit, because even if they did share it, then you would expect O2 to be higher here. You wouldn't expect to see much of a difference. So if you didn't see a difference, you might blame it on design contamination. But if you did see a big difference here, it's the best evidence that you're possibly going to get in this scenario. There may still be some alternate explanations, but this is the gold standard of experimental design for a reason, because you controlled for as many possible alternate explanations as you can. It's still not necessarily perfect. So like the first one, this is a between subjects design because each group gets a different treatment. We can, in this case, by experimental terminology, consider these two groups to be equivalent because of the randomization. Are they actually equivalent? We don't know, because again, this is random and it could be randomly bad, right? Just like with our random sample. But in terms of experimental terminology, this would be considered equivalent groups. You would be comparing the gains. So you could do the difference again, or you could compare the O2s if the O1s are the same. Okay, questions about these? So I'm going to show you in a few slides the type of question that you would see on an exam about experiments. I'm not going to ask you to name this experimental design or anything like that. I'm more looking for you to do exactly the kind of thing that we just did. Just think through if this was your design, what might the problems be? Okay, so I did want to talk a little bit about validity. I said at the end of the lecture for this week that I would tell you some specific validity threats for experiments. There's a lot of them, and there's actually a handout in Sakai if you want and are interested in these validity threats. If you want to look at them or refresh your memory of them after today, you can. This is another thing I wouldn't ask you specifically. I wouldn't expect you to be able to name these, but these are the types of problems that you might look for when you're reading about other people's experiments, including the one we're going to read today. So a reminder, these are specific to experiments, but all of those other validity concerns that we've talked about also still apply. Like, are your questions well worded? Does the way that you've defined and operationalized your variable actually make sense? And we used this example earlier, but I'll say it again. If you were trying to test users' computer competency and the way that you decided to measure that was typing speed, that's never going to be a valid measurement because typing speed is not equivalent to computer competency. It might be reliable, might be repeatable, but it's not going to be valid. So with that said, there's a few named validity threats for experiments. One is history, and that would be if something that you didn't anticipate happened during the experiment that affected your outcome variable. An example might be if you're testing the impact of a cultural competency curriculum that you designed, you're training academic librarians over the course of a semester, and midway through the semester-long training program, the campus is embroiled in a scandal when the university president makes a racist remark on camera. And all of a sudden, this thing that you're teaching about is a big deal and everybody's talking about it. That's going to impact the validity because you can't say whether it was your curriculum or the scandal that increased people's cultural competency, if indeed you do see that it was raised. Maturation happens when levels of the variable that you're measuring change just due to normal developmental processes. So if you measure high school students' information literacy competency in September, and then again at the end of the school year, that's a really long time that's passed, and they may have gained information literacy skills from just anywhere, not necessarily the one intervention that you're trying to test. So the way to avoid this one is to have experiments happen within a pretty short time frame. Regression effects. If you choose your experimental subjects based on extreme scores, then they're going to tend to regress toward the mean on subsequent tests simply because of error. That's a lot of jargon, so let me give a concrete example. Let's say that you're doing a incoming first-year student information literacy like crash course. Your university wants to implement this for incoming first-year students who have scored really low on whatever incoming exam they have. If all you're doing is taking the bottom 10%, then you're going to see gains almost guaranteed in that test simply because some portion of that 10% didn't score badly the first time because they don't know it. They scored badly because they weren't interested in the test, or they didn't have breakfast that morning, or some other reason that has nothing to do with their knowledge. So they will score better because you selected them from this extreme category. But it's not, again, not necessarily because of whatever you're doing to try to improve your scores. Similarly, if you take the top 10%, they're probably going to score worse next time. It's just nothing toward direction toward the mean. Mortality, we've talked about this one before when we talked about sampling and people are not dying, hopefully, in your experiment. It's just that if everyone who finds the experimental intervention too hard drops out of your study, then that's going to be a problem for trying to make it valid. Testing effect is when pre-test affects scores on the post-test. So if you want to test whether your new curriculum improves information literacy, but the pre-test basically sensitizes people to the types of questions that you're going to ask, so they score better the second time just because you've already seen it once. If you have a control group, then you can help control for that. What a control group does. Another option is not to give a pre-test, but there's problems with that, and you don't have a baseline. We talked about groups not being equivalent at the start of the study, like the Monday, Wednesday, Tuesday, Thursday section. The response to that is to try to randomize if you can, but sometimes you can't because you have to work with naturally occurring groups. And then these two are my favorite. So there's design contamination. That's when people who are in the experimental group share the treatment across the group and the control group who aren't otherwise getting it. And then my very favorite ones are the John Henry effect and resentful demoralization, which are opposite sides of the same coin. Anyone know who John Henry was? So he was an African American folk hero. There are various, like several towns in the U.S. that claim to be the place where this happened. And unclear whether it's actually happened or it's just folklore. But the story goes that John Henry was a rail driver, hammered the nails into the railroad tracks. And when industrialization happened, there was a steel rail driver that could outperform any person, and he challenged the steel driver to a race. And he won, and as he drove the last nail in, he had a heart attack and died. It's kind of a bad, terrible story. But the reason that he lends his name to this is the idea is that people in the control group know that they're not receiving the treatment, and so they purposefully overperform. That's the John Henry effect, to try to say like, I'm going to do it anyway, even though you didn't give me the Pathfinders, whatever. Or resentful demoralization is the opposite. You're not giving me the treatment. I'm just going to tank the last test on purpose. So underperform and ruin your test. So this only happens if people know that they're in the control group and they're not receiving the intervention, which is why in medical experiments, people are given placebos and they're not told whether or not they're getting the real drug. So that this doesn't happen, even like called the like brain and body together. Yes, it's Friday. Yes. Okay, so there's a lot of these. I don't expect you to remember all of the names of these. Again, if you are in a track where you're likely to be doing experiments, you're going to have some more instruction in this other class. There's also, though, some generalizability threats that are specific to experiments. This one's not. Core sampling is obviously a generalizability threat across the board. But in experiments, there's a Hawthorne effect. That's when participants modify their behavior because they know that they're being observed, which means that if they were to be asked to do that behavior, or if they were doing that behavior out in the real world, it might be different than what you're seeing. And that's also related to the ecological validity that we talked about. Real life is messy. When we try to control everything, what it means is that we're making it less realistic, and therefore more likely that people are not going to behave the same way as they would outside of the lab or wherever else we're doing our. Okay, so this is the type of question that you would see on an exam related to experiments. So there's a lot here. I'm going to read it out loud. Janelle designs an experiment to test the impact of visual design on search behavior. So she's built two interfaces. One's a standard interface, Google, and one is stylized that she's reworked to include brighter colors and modern fonts. So she has participants conduct 4 searches. All participants conduct these 4 searches in the exact same order. The first 2 are on the stylized interface, and she asked them to search for fan fiction and how to make a GIF. The second 2 are on the standard interface, and she asked them to search for types of graphs and how to think states. So then she collects data for each of those 4 searches, including the time spent with each set of search results, the number of documents accessed, and the number of results pages. And here are her results. So with this stylized interface, in the first search, fan fiction, people spent an average of 12 minutes on the page, accessed 11 documents, and viewed 2.12 results pages. Pick making was a little lower, and then you've got a big drop off here for search number 3 and 4 with the standard interface. So she wants to know, is this my new stylized interface that is causing these differences? Can she say that with the way that she's designed this? Why not?
Well, personally, I'm like the first 2 searches are more interesting, so you might spend more time reading fan fiction than reading about your types of graphs.
Yeah, so there's a big qualitative difference between the search prompts that she's given folks, these being more popularly interesting, and these not so much. What else is another problem?
Just you're comparing 2 different sets of searches, so.
Yeah, they're very different. What about the order that she's giving them in?
You could have gotten fatigued over time.
Yeah, it's natural for people if you've asked them to conduct 4 searches, it's natural for them to not spend as much time or not access as many articles on the last one. And it just so happens that her standard interface is always last for every participant. So you would expect to see some sort of a drop off here anyway. Now there's a big one here, but again, you can probably attribute that to the difference in search prompts. So she really can't say anything about whether this was the stylized interface versus standard interface. This is just a really bad design. What she could do instead is she could have multiple groups. She could basically mix it up or counterbalance it like the Shawcroft and Horowitz tried to do, where sometimes some people start with the stylized interface first, some start with the standard interface first, and the order of these is randomized as well as which interface you get it with. So some people get fan fiction and standard interface first, and then maybe stylized and stain cleaning, and then standard and grass types, and then stylized and cleaning, right? And you try to do all of those different combinations. It requires a lot more people in your experimental group because you have to have, that would be 16 different combinations of ordered searches. And ideally you would want more than one person in each of those conditions so that you can average across the conditions. So you need big pools of participants when you have designs like that, but it gives you much, much, much better results. Okay, any questions about that? Note that you can answer that question without any specialized terminology, right? It's just, this is really bad. You all knew that immediately that it was really bad. It's just a matter of out of that. Okay, so we're going to talk about Shawcroft and Horowitz, speaking of explaining how things are bad. And I just have 3 questions about this. Again, because we're just touching the surface of the experiments, but I think they'll allow us to get at the main issues here. And then afterwards, we'll unpack the main issues with some slides, screenshots. Okay, so I think the group is going to have you mix up. Are you going to have people mix up? Okay. So for this, I'm just going to have you work with folks around you, and our class is small today, so maybe like you3, and then you3 and you3. Okay. So I'm going to put a timer up here. It's just 3 questions. The last one has a longer time. The first one is, what was the research question? Is it good? If you need a reminder of what a good research question is, these are the criteria that we talked about. So go ahead and see if you can find the research questions on, I think, the first page of the article. Go ahead and chat about that.
Librarians provide equitable virtual reference services to visitors and discriminants.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like that's
Yeah, it's like I understand.
Do we think this is a great
question? Yeah. It's like, how are you doing it?
They did it.
Make sure you read the second sentence that comes right after their research question because they clarify something.
I think after that, I put it was more like.
Did that one.
Okay.
Yeah, it said America and Europe and more. Yeah, just very bad explanation.
Interesting. Yeah, I feel like one of the regions.
Is it good? Is this like question good? Sure. Like I
yeah.
Parts of the way that they were, I don't know, or something like how they talked about finance. So basically, like, the person's like education like this semester. And I remember like as things like gender sensitivity increase, whether or not that voice. Yeah. And so I know that like they're talking about librarians having their online
choice
and that
of
kind of
like,
thing. And I guess like
I feel like they should really like, I don't know, like
people
value.
I don't know. I just wonder if that's like
Very, I don't know, like it seems
it's very hard to apply.
Yeah.
But I guess it's just but I do wonder how that will change or if that's really relevant. Yes. Yeah. And I also, I don't know, it's interesting to think about like all the different people
yeah, right.
who may work in institutions and like
Our chat is totally anonymous. Like we can't see people's names
Yeah.
or anything about them.
Well,
It's like a string of numbers.
And they talk about in here that like
Right.
when they talk to like librarians about doing study, there's
Yeah.
when they said like virtual reference, they thought
it's also weird to measure it with the chat.
but instead they did it like through emails.
Yeah.
It's really- yeah, no, that's true. But yeah, I've never had.
Okay, it's gonna
a
sound like people have
interaction.
covered the research question. I'm gonna go ahead and go on to the next question, which is, what's the population that they would like to say something about?
Yeah.
What were their sampling techniques? And how can we be sure that the people who answered their questions were actual members of their target population? Can we be sure?
So I guess their population. Yeah, and it was reference librarians, right? So I guess in theory, it could be like student working at the population. So I guess there isn't really a way to vet if you're sending it to a general email.
Yeah.
And
It's just
then,
like it depends on the institution.
well, it's
And then like.
subjects, I guess.
Yeah, well, and also there's just like they say they're also targeting gender, like for virtual references or in gender like because you have like it's not like two like Caucasian or white.
I remember the sample was small.
Female, so
Yeah.
they had the different libraries.
And then.
They said how randomized how many couple of libraries are kind of kind of I wasn't really good graphs and everything. There was like so much going does not understand. Yeah. I was looking at their like pie charts. So yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So
it really,
they are recommended library chart.
kind of bothered me.
I'll send an email.
Average when they put Christian as the Caucasian and
So that's
Yeah, they were
and I was like,
these things like without like reason, like
Yeah.
rationale.
they're different.
It's a long one.
Yeah, exactly.
It was clear
So,
the
yeah,
librarians
we
like
talked
they
about
were
it,
outside
research question and now the clarified question, just kind of just going
affiliation with
sampling
their institution, which also made them like not.
So yeah, right, yeah,
Like the way they usually would.
we were just
Right.
sampling
Yeah.
techniques, I guess, of it, sending. And then our kids, 20.
The sampling, I think it was, one subject, but I guess like,
So, like
Oh, so maybe it was
I
a shared
was
email
like,
or
I
something
don't-
and then actual
like
library.
these, like the colors, especially on these,
Like maybe like
ones,
just
when they,
don't
Yeah.
have, so like I'm understanding.
That would-
yeah, they didn't write whoever responded was.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess it was not.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, even me, I'm on the other end of that chat. 2 or 3 hours out of the week, so. Yeah.
They'll say figure 7, and figure 7 is like 2 pages away. I'm like I was looking at this wrong graph.
Depends on like the time in the semester, around when like major projects are due, especially for English 105 classes, you get a lot of questions about like citing sources
Yeah.
for different articles. And then it kind of happens again.
All right, I'm gonna go on to the last question because it's just a catch-all. Basically, what are the problems? And there's a lot of them.
Yeah.
What might make you less inclined to read?
I don't think they have enough like variation and like.
Oh, okay.
One
Yeah,
of
there's a
the
lot
stories
about that.
I didn't know
They say in the article that
but for demographic they assign are stay the same or if they like re-demographic.
Because they're all.
Weekend. Right.
But then we continue to compare married to
In the library.
And I was like, why?
there's also
But
Yeah,
I think one of the main things was the team and then not having it be the same person replying, not knowing who the person is, and not taking diversity within
Yeah.
the
It was a little
subject
strange.
pool into account when they're talking about
I think it's not the same.
likely
Right.
applying everything like that.
Like, I don't
And then
think
also
it's
just
more
saying,
religion than anything.
when I have as a basis of
Someone named Mary Anderson, it's like, how do you get
social
everything from that?
assumption, I feel like it.
and so they're like, okay,
I mean,
we have to remember that they had longer
I don't know how else I would
their response
So
because it's
about
weekend, but the other
doing
people didn't have that. So
virtual,
you're like,
yeah,
this
and
graph
our
is
evening,
sensitive.
yeah, there was no like just easily like this for the should be the primary way or like first names that are
Also didn't control for.
more popular.
They were gonna do that.
Also this
So they didn't have enough
So I think that it's not like. But it's like,
They didn't like.
That's very true.
It looks
Well,
like
I didn't think about
I think they didn't collect enough
Yeah.
data.
Well, that's just funny. And this one
to like
to me was
make sure
really
that they could like drop.
It was like
So there was
yeah,
explanation.
Right.
exactly.
Like it's-
Yeah, exactly.
Very
Exactly.
Yeah. I would even make that.
Right, exactly.
I already showed it.
Yeah.
They're like,
Yeah, that doesn't make sense.
Right.
If I would expect that, I was very happy.
Like, some
Yeah.
people wouldn't know what a traditional Jewish house is.
Yeah.
Or maybe they're just familiar with it, or maybe they have like other kind of like experiences.
Yeah.
And they gave like suggestions
So it
about
doesn't
all
even
kinds
make
of
sense.
things.
I was a
little
little
curious. Yeah.
Right.
training.
Like it makes
Yeah.
sense to have like
Did, for example,
a dot.
did they send out like each of the questions under each
But yeah, I don't know if it really got
at any point because like,
It was.
like
And it was like strange.
or like about turnover for like reference questions.
I don't know.
And there are like several
So
things that
I would be interested, like you said,
being outside the institution
they did
and like what the reference question was like more difficult for them to do the library.
A very. I'm just like very.
but I do understand we didn't know.
He was like, I don't want to be addressed.
Yeah.
And then so like how do you, if someone proposes it, like I don't want to be addressed.
Okay, but that just.
Yeah, and the way that they,
Exactly.
did that was something to do with like.
Exactly.
Yeah, I know like
Also, this is
It's
like
like-
the number messages, like the volume.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
The difference
I
between
grew up in the South.
like someone who's like 2 or 3 years.
So same,
Yeah.
yeah, my
It's like-
personality.
Yeah, given the sample
Everyone's got
Yeah.
their, like,
And then the thing like, I don't know,
So,
I
but
think it's
that's like the different, like, so it's like,
they're talking about
you know,
first name versus middle name, and I was like, well, it's like, I'm trying to be familiar with.
In a way, I
And
think they just had a lot of like.
Just really, you know, point of view.
Yeah.
They didn't
Too much
explain
technology.
outside.
But
But just
the wait
when you
time
do
is
that-
crazy.
I think if they had removed this, would be like, I want to trust this.
Interesting. That may have been a work.
And then also within asking for different resources.
Yeah.
Because like I know that they had to do it in a way that
Yeah.
where they wouldn't be able to tell that it was a group asking for stuff. So they wouldn't know that it was part of the city, but by asking different, well, I mean, for different references, I feel like based on what that reference is.
Yeah, I mean, they.
You know, like it would actually time and issue questions, that kind of stuff.
Because some of these ones are more difficult than others, I feel like.
Yeah.
Yeah, like the number of replies.
Yes, yeah.
Mary had the most.
Yeah.
With 14
Yeah.
replies.
I think it also
Trying to think about how they like.
there's gonna be variables to
helicopter, like sample.
It's not hard.
We sent it to,
Compare, you don't even have
There's
to.
also
I know, and they talked about how some people tried after 31 days,
Yeah.
and so they didn't approve it.
But it's like,
But I guess
Or-
gender and.
Well, I guess I could try to get
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know,
a lot of paragraphs.
Yeah.
It didn't really explain anything after that.
Like a strap.
Yes, I hate those.
Yeah, and like, let's say like the library was really busy that
I'm
week
surprised.
and they
And the line graph.
don't prioritize that. So like at the bottom, because of situations that like they wouldn't have done that.
Like, you know, like,
Would you help us find them?
No libraries
Like, because they are like, you know,
Yeah, I should
libraries.
really
Don't feel like
maybe all during
they
the
experiment.
Yeah, it's a hard.
But as a comprehensive, you need to be like,
I don't know why they.
There was the assumption that some APs got applies later than others.
They have like one. It didn't seem like.
We did talk about like
I
was
think,
awesome, maybe
yeah.
they didn't respond right away.
Oh, I wonder if it's a library, like depending on the library,
Days,
I wonder if
librarians.
they don't receive a lot of requests.
Some of the replies to what's going on at
Specific
weeks after they.
Yeah, and so maybe they know that it's the setting.
Yeah. That's also.
No, they're pretty terrible.
They're like,
They're hard to
horrible.
the response is great for the response.
Yeah.
Yeah. How did this guy?
Yeah.
Oh, you're in that class.
Yeah, interesting. That was like your
Yeah.
first.
That's Heminger, they both teach similar classes. The group that teaches programming with data is like a programming type of class. Yes, yeah, I want to take But I think even if you weren't a visualization expert, you would look at this and be like, this is awful. Who made these visualizations? Like,
Excel.
you can even do better with that cell than this. Pretty powerful. I know.
Yeah, I felt like we didn't
What did they
realize
do?
that until like.
Anyway, it just doesn't tell you anything about the data anyway.
And you don't know anything about the institutions that you sent them to.
Right, yeah, no, we don't want to. All right, I'm gonna stop that before the group search, I think. All right. So there's so much to talk about here. Let's start with the research question. So it says, this study focuses on the following research questions. Are virtual reference services color and gender blind? And are they providing unbiased services to diverse age groups? More specifically, this study clarifies who is more likely to be discriminated against online by virtual reference librarians. What do you think about this question? Okay.
It was like a two-part.
It is a two-part. What about this gender piece? Did they actually answer that?
No.
So the design of their experiment, they weren't even able to address the gender piece. They did, however, talk quite a lot about religion, which is not in the question at all. Again, I guess if you're being charitable, you can say diversity. Do you think some version of this question is important to the field?
Yes. Sure.
Yeah, I would agree. And if I had to say, people have asked me like every semester, why was this published? And if I had to take a guess, I would say that that is the reason, because it is an important question. And this, if nothing else, this article gives future researchers something to respond to. So they're trying to get at like ethnic group / racial group, which are not the same, but they don't seem to know the difference. And gender and religious group. And they're trying to look at all three of these at the same time and figure out how that impacts quality of service. So they're trying to do a lot with this question. The second part of this
What did you think about this then? More specifically, the study clarifies who is more likely to be discriminated against. Yeah.
I feel like that doesn't really actually, it's not really actually a more specific version of the previous question. It seems to be kind of like a completely different question.
Yeah.
They're not really clarifying the previous question. They're talking about bias versus discrimination, like, which are different.
Yeah. And the way that this is phrased also assumes that discrimination is definitely present, right?
And the reason for what's happening.
Yeah. Who is more likely to be discriminated against? Like, we're definitely going to find something. Let's see who's most likely to be discriminated against. All right. The way they did this as an unobtrusive study, which meant that they tried to do it with people not knowing. However, that was compromised somewhat by the fact that they did get in touch with the head of the libraries to ask their permission. They had a pretty small sample that got back and said it was okay. And we don't know whether the heads of libraries controlled their staff happening. So they may or may not be in an obtrusive study. Their staff may have been told, like, hey, look out for emails from unaffiliated people because they're trying to test whether you're racist. We don't know what they said. This would also be considered an in vivo experiment because it's not done in a lab. It's done in real world work settings. So that does lend it a little bit of ecological validity. And then this is just a review. What did you think? So the way that they decided to operationalize ethnicity, religion, and gender was through the use of names. So they chose LaToya Johnson to represent female and African American, Rosa Manuz for Hispanic, Tang Su for Asian, Mary Anderson for Caucasian Christian or Christian Caucasian, and then Ahmed Ibrahim for Muslim, alternately referred to as Arab, not the same thing, and Moshe Cohen for Jewish. What do you think about using names to identify all of these things? Were there choices of names specifically? Jillian?
I think generally the interpretation would be variable. I don't think the same people would assume reading a name like across the board about what it lends to their ethnic or religious identity.
Yeah, but I can tell you personally, this is maybe a little embarrassing because I've been told that Moshe Cohen is the most Jewish name ever. But when I was 19 and working in the BioSci library at Duke, if I had gotten a request from someone, Jewish would not have popped into my mind. I might have thought, oh, that's an unusual name. I grew up in the Deep South and did not know many Jewish people. I would not have known. I don't know now. But you're relying on people to make these connections, especially with something like Mary Anderson. I'm not sure that my mind would immediately jump to white Christian. And so that connection is maybe not as strong as they are claiming it to be. With that said, this is a pretty common practice in these types of studies. So one area where names are used very often in studies like this is to test hiring discrimination. So they'll send out resumes to these jobs that are like on Indeed.com, right? And they're going to get thousands of applications. So this is not adding significantly to any person's workload. It's not like they're it's deceptive, but it's not considered unethical. But they're sending these resumes, and they'll send out thousands of them, and half of them will have white coded names, and half of them will have maybe Latino coded names or Muslim coded names, Black coded names. In those cases, they generally only test one variable. So all of the names are male, for example, and they're only varying the race. Or they're only testing, for example, gender. So all of the names might be white coded, but they're some are male coded, some are female coded. So there's one variable instead of like 3 or 4, like here. And they won't just choose a single name to represent white people. They'll choose like 10, and they'll send out like 5,000 applications, 2,500 white coded with 10 different white names that they'll then average, and 10 different Black names that they'll all average. So that it's a lot more rigorous than what was done here with just choosing a single name. And those studies, by the way, have been really important, and they've told us really valuable information about hiring discrimination. I mean, it's been shown over and over and over that someone with a white coded name is much more likely to get a call back than someone with an sounding name. So that's important research, but maybe the application here was not all that we might desire. Any other comments on the names? Okay. For their output variable, they wanted to measure quality of service, and the way that they decided to operationalize that was by looking at the RUSA guidelines. I actually think this is one of the best parts of the paper, that if you have to choose quality of service, then looking at what your professional organization says is high quality service is a pretty good way to try to measure that. And so they looked at these specific guidelines from RUSA, and then they described how they coded whether or not that thing was present in the email. So for example, did the librarian explain the policies? That was counted as a mark toward quality service. So this I don't think was that bad. I actually think if I had to choose the best part of the paper. Now, they said that they used a counterbalance method, but in all of the dozens of diagrams included, they did not actually diagram their experiment, which would have been really helpful. So this is what it actually looked like. They described this in words, but a picture could have been sufficient. What they did was in week 1, they sent all 5 groups different questions, all from Mary. And then in week 2, all of the libraries got different questions from Portia. And then week 3 from Ed, and for Latoya wrote them. So over the course of the experiment, each of the groups got all 5 questions plus 1 duplicate question. I don't know why they couldn't just come up with 6 questions, but they got all of the questions from a different person. That makes sense. The problem was that they sent Mary's and Latoya's out during the weekend for reasons. I don't know. And they don't even tell us like more than that. I don't know if the weekend meant they sent it Friday night or Saturday morning or Sunday midday. We don't know. But basically that meant that they couldn't then make any meaningful comparisons across gender. And it also threw off all of their timely response data. Any questions about the way that they designed the study? All right, so then we have their results. Response time. They said, oh, poor Ahmed was discriminated against because his response time is so bad compared to everyone else. And oh, by the way, we're not looking at these 2 because these were weekend. So if you only compare these remaining 4, Ahmed looks terrible. But then they give you this chart, which is the actual breakdown of when these people got responses. And if you actually look at Ahmed's columns, he got over 80% of his responses either the same day or the next day. And he got over 90% of his responses within 3 days. The one that's throwing it off, and I would guess this is 1, maybe 2, are 2 that were 31 days out. And so that's really throwing off the average. But if you look at actually like the median, he is not that different from anyone else. And obviously, Latoya's and Mary's are kind of messes because, again, they were sent out during the weekend. So if you're only comparing these 4, not actually that different. Again, we don't know when this was sent out. So those averages can hide outliers, which is what we have here. Similarly, they say, oh, Moishe got such great service because the average number of words in his responses was much higher. They don't give you a diagram that breaks it down in this case like they did last time. So we don't know, but I would suspect based on the quality of the rest of the article, this could have been really high simply because one response copied and pasted an entire article and sent it to him in the text of the email. And then voila, your average response is really high. So they're saying that this is an indicator that Moishe is getting much better quality service than anyone else. I'm not convinced. They also decided to measure satisfaction. So these are hypothetical people, right? They're not going to be satisfied or dissatisfied, and you can't ask them because they're made up people. So they decided to say, well, the ratio of the number of responses back to that. They decided to measure satisfaction of these hypothetical data people by the number of responses they got versus actual answers to their questions. And again, there's not huge differences here, but their argument was that med again received poorer service than anyone else. If you buy that the ratio of replies versus answers is equivalent to satisfaction hypothetical. They also equated respect. The way that they measured respect was by did the librarian include reading. Again, looking at this, I don't see huge differences, but again, they said med was lower, and they had some discussion about these results and whether the lack of honorific might relate to people's uncertainty about first name versus last name, or how to address people who are Asian to Mr. Chang. They don't know. So their conclusions are, on all codes and attributes that were examined, Latoya and Ahmed were discriminated against when compared with the level of service Moisha and Mary received. Discriminatory behaviors were evident in the provision of online reference services to Arabs. Again, not the same as Muslim people, and African Americans when compared with white, Caucasian, Jewish. I don't even know. Or Christian users. So again, we have the conflation of identities here, confusion between gender, race, ethnicity, all of that, religion. And this very definitive statement that Latoya and Ahmed were discriminated against. Our results showed that. What do we think? Are we willing to agree with that? So to summarize the issues, some of them. The problem statement assumes that you're going to see discrimination. Gender is not actually addressed in the study. Ethnicity, religion, and gender are confused throughout the study and confounded throughout the study. There's a small sample size. There's the difficulty of interpreting response time data because they sent 2 of them out during the weekend. They reported averages in some cases where a median or more specific data would have been really helpful, at least a range. We also don't know who is responding to these queries, and I heard some of you talking about that. Like I said, I used to work at the Duke Biosci Library, and I was 19, and I responded to stuff like that. I'm sure that some of you working at libraries respond to requests like this. Maybe not over email so much anymore, but like, the chat desk is staffed by students a lot. So it's not necessarily reference librarians who are even answering these questions. Maybe completely untrained students. Any other issues that I'm missing here? Yeah.
Just the graphs were awful.
Yeah.
It was like they had like a 20 graph checkbox, and they were like, how can we put this into an infographic?
Yeah. And with all of those, they were still missing some that might actually have been helpful, like the design of their study. And it just looked unprofessional too. The graphs and stuff clearly came straight out of Excel or something like that with the default setting.
I think the clarity of the graphs added to this horrible graph thing, because for me the colors, especially the yellows on that one, I'm like, I can't even I can't tell on my computer screen what's different. Graph look at graph 7. Graph 7 is 3 pages down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the gray background.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, and the pie chart that they felt the need to make reviews.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah, it's not great design, and I'm actually really surprised that this journal didn't make them redo those or redo them in house. They're
Yeah, definitely.
really bad.
Yeah.
Really bad. So they do give a little caution that you shouldn't generalize based on these results. The sample size is not large enough. Future studies should examine to figure out whether these differences are statistically significant or even actually present. With all of this said, if you look at how these results are cited, for the most part, people cite this paper as if they agree with what these people found. So it says, Shotov and Horowitz report different levels of service. One study, the results indicated marked inequalities in tone and speed of response. This research has serious implications for interaction. So again, this is someone who maybe didn't read the paper very critically and is just citing it as if it is like accurate, true. Latoya and Med were discriminated against the most. And then this one is the most qualified. It's like, their findings suggest that there may be some inequality in reference services, particularly when engaged with patients perceived to be of African American or Arab descent. I think that that's the most responsible way of citing this paper, unless you're going to just take it on and actually evaluate it in your lit review and say there were serious problems with the methodology of this paper. This is what they found. However, there's reason to doubt those findings. And there was a follow-up by these same authors 2 years later with a very large sample size, and they did not find anything. The study found no significant differences among user groups among any of the dimensions, supporting that the virtual environment facilitates equitable service. With that said, the original study is still the one that's more often cited, because it's like a result. Right? We don't often cite no findings, even though I would argue that this is more important, especially given that they fixed some of the design issues from the first study. Okay, as a cautionary tale. Any questions? All right, we're going to take a break, and as soon as we get back from the break, I'm going to turn it over to our student group. And then we have time, which I think we will, after the student group goes, we're going to watch a video of a really extremely bad interview.
I'm excited.
It's like critique the bad things today. It's therapeutic. All right, so go ahead.
A good bad example.
Yes.
Really small.
Yeah, you're gonna have repeat theory.
Yeah.
I heard there were 2 people that were sick. Oh, and one person.
Yeah, I think one.
Oh, I didn't tell you how long the break should be. It's 10 minutes. 11:30. Yeah, I was like, do I have time to go to the student store? And I'm like, I mean, you want to go? Maybe.
We should ask for that, because
I mean, seriously, for 5 minutes.
Oh, okay.
So, how did you integrate the
No, I don't work on Fridays. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's like my schedule lends itself to like large chunks of time on Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. At that point, I wouldn't come in on Fridays. I mean, I couldn't because I'm not over hours, but
Just to make sure it doesn't.
I'm sure. So,
Maybe she'll take time for me.
yeah. They're probably
For Monday. That's so great. I love how you did
I know. Yes. I was like, yes, there's treat during.
that. So you were in the office before class.
Sure. So on Mondays, yeah. Fridays I have a class and this time goes better. But
Yeah.
because of, like.
Yeah, I just added password manager, so I don't even remember.
Yeah,
my
no,
name.
same.
Yeah, it's really not ideal because I'm late for work. We're there for like.
Oh,
15
yeah.
minutes, and then I come back. So-
That's awesome. I consider putting my phone like that. Coming in like before class and back after class, even if it's just for like an hour at a time.
Mhm.
But it takes me a while once I get into the office to get settled in the first place. And it's like then I that usually most of my time.
I don't want to do it. So annoying.
I don't think.
I didn't do it on, I mean, I haven't done a lot of apps, but
Here,
I'll probably end up working a lot this week. So it'll be kind of boring, are you gonna add to that? It's hard. It'll be nice to have a week for the classes, yeah.
This is our document. You this is this.
So it should be % for
I know, I don't even know when.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's something similar.
I can. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
When we're in the conversation. And then.
Yeah, I mean, I've been like just looking at
Everything worked out.
options because I originally had wanted to go early to spend some time in another city, like solo travel. And I thought about this, but then when I was looking at flights, like it just didn't really work out. And I was like, well, I've always wanted to go. So like maybe I'll, but it's super expensive for me for all of us. I was like, oh, just round trip after. And then I was like, well, maybe, you know, if there's this group going and flying out of Washington D.C., I should just like join that group because then it saves money. So getting to DC, be on the same flight. Yeah. There's so many different variables, but now I just make
Oh, yeah.
I need to ask, what are you trying to?
I'm trying to decide like the best option for me and get to Barcelona.
Oh,
You're
yeah.
going to, right? Yes. It took me a number of hours to spreadsheet and cost compare.
That's like what I'm in.
Yeah,
Ooh.
it's tough.
Yeah. I compared like one-way flights to different places. 'Cause I didn't have it before versus going, I ended up doing a round trip to Barcelona from DC and then like discount airfare from Barcelona.
I know, I really thought it would be
Yeah.
Nice.
And then one of them was only $20 and one of them was like 100. So it was completely.
Where else are you going?
I'm planning on doing like a driving trip through the UK.
Oh, awesome. The other like thing now that I'm considering is because originally, when Carolyn was in the place, she found one that had a 20-hour layover in Morocco, and I was like, yes, we're gonna do that because we'll get to spend one night in Morocco, which for no extra cost. Essentially. And now I found that one, like the ones flying to Lisbon often have a layover.
Yeah, but Tap Air Portugal has some 3 up to 6 days of layover in Lisbon. I looked at that too.
Yeah.
I'm like, go there. Plan an
And that's like cutting
escapade
it so close.
for 8 hours.
Yeah.
I'm like,
That's like the worst layover because it's like way too much time to spend in the airport. But it would end
Not
up
enough
cutting
time
it
to
close
do.
to really go out and see anything, you know?
Yeah, the Lisbon ones I ended up going because I can't remember if it's tag policy or something. Because it isn't like a short flight, but it's still on like a It's
March
kind of
20th, yeah.
So
It's after
it's
spring
gonna be
break.
like weird to look at.
We can study during spring break.
I think I saw that it was extra protected, but I also getting a period on it.
I'm staying for so long that I'm planning on like bringing a check.
Yeah.
Leaving it at the hotel or something, and then when I
Exactly.
leave, I'll just take mine.
Yes. I really need to.
But I have to do laundry.
Oh, wow. So what did you say?
Thank you.
Oh, wow. You're leaving super early.
I know.
That's awesome. I mean,
That's amazing.
I
Okay.
really
Well,
like
and that's the
going
thing, I'm
through
frustrated because
all the
a lot of the changes are earlier in May, but I can't take that much time off. My contract doesn't end until the end of May, so I'm already.
Oh,
like,
you're on
dipping out.
contract?
Yeah. I'm just thinking like
Really?
crazy about
Or you're not, oh, you're not on the grants.
No.
Yeah.
Plus I have to get back because I'm helping with an exhibit at Will's since June 20th. And it's like, I cut into June that much.
It's like, I can't remember. Yeah.
Because basically I'm like, okay, I might have something going on the first 2 weeks in May. I was like, okay, I don't work during May.
Yeah.
June.
So are you planning to be here over that time?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
Well, I mean,
Yeah,
I live here. Sorry, I was like, no, I was trying to like think about because well, also yeah,
and I talk about it. I think that's
I'm on the ground.
so it's year round.
Well, yeah, it's your technically like I'm.
This does our results in small groups in March.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but I like, I mean.
To discuss the homework we already
No,
done.
I'm
So we'll give it a
I
chance.
see.
It's different on my contract. It's like they do the academic school year basically August.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So like the
And then
cat.
yeah. And then I'll have a summer contract for 2 months and it will start again. Yeah. To get that one.
Yeah. So no, mine is like, do you get academic breaks off or do you work through the academic?
I said, I told people like,
Yeah.
so.
I'll bring
Like,
it. I get days off according to what staff gets off.
Okay, same.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm trying to like, sorry, Allison, I will let you in whenever.
It's only like 11:15.
Yeah, it's bananas.
Yeah.
That's what I do.
It's so good.
Oh,
I did
really?
that today too.
No. I was like, I went out to eat it last night.
Yeah, so basically we're going like I'm going home for spring break. What's my so like I figure out how to for that. And that's just like the agreement I have with Snowy basically.
Right.
And then she's like, well, I can like not work basically today. I work basically June list.
Oh.
Is what we're doing.
That's really
Yeah, usually, I usually,
They're all
text them, but, I know that like,
Then
I should just look at them, because I know some people who,
A lot of them are very chill about it. Like,
are
my
we
house is like,
something like a whole month thing, or I'm used to that with kids too, but I don't have it either.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm like in constant.
Oh, yeah.
On the one hand, like wider breadth of experience is really important, and on the other hand, that feels good to do it. Right now, I'm mostly lacking.
Yeah, I know. Is it a semester?
For like a semester, or a year, and then it's on something else.
So you want
I
to
want to
like,
try to build
yeah.
this early.
Yeah, well, you're petting duty, so you're
Yes.
I mean, I think that would make sense. Yeah, I'm not planning on like locating doing archives currently. So I really enjoyed it.
I'm learning a lot, but yeah, I'm learning a No, I don't mind. Stand beside you. Or behind you. That's okay. I feel protected. Yeah, I was like, all around me.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Having,
Yeah. That's true. I used to sleep like
do that sometimes, and then
It's like
Snapchat,
shared
we
a
have
room
that.
for us, so I kept growing up.
Some videos that
I had these often.
but
And it
usually
was always like bars around like half of it. And yeah, I would feel like. But then of course the open side is like the top and you fall. Yeah, exactly. So I would always be very highly aware of that.
I fell off on a
Oh no.
summer.
Oh yeah, it's just a moment.
Ow.
Yeah.
I never.
No. No. It's just such a pain.
I had to go louder.
That's fine.
I know. It's like
No,
I'm
I'm
a little louder to get to bed.
I never like being on the top. But this is because like I have background. So I was like, there's a lot of potential.
Okay, I think everybody's back. So, I'm not gonna stand up. I'm just gonna turn it over. I'm hungry. I will close the door though.
Okay, dokie.
just saying, like it's actually.
Allison.
Hello, I am Allison,
I'm Jay Mowbray.
and we are going to be talking about semi-structured interviews and whether they are good, bad, what we think about them. It's going to be great. So, our learning objectives, these are just things maybe to keep in mind as we're discussing this. The first is evaluate the efficacy of semi-structured interviews. So what do you think about semi-structured interviews as a whole? What have you seen in semi-structured interviews that you thought was effective, ineffective in this study and other studies? And we'll get to that as well. Determine how methodological approach is informed by research questions. So think about maybe how the research question in this article informed the procedures and interviews that the researcher decided to pursue. And then maybe discuss the ethical considerations involved in the relationship. I know there was a lot of consideration of ethics and confidentiality and things like that in this study. So maybe think about how that might have impacted the relationship between the interviewer and the subjects, for better or for worse, whatever you think. Right, so I'll turn it over for.
Yeah, so to go ahead and get started with just refreshing ourselves about what was going on in the experiment and a little bit of a framework to evaluate it against. If you remember way back to week 1 and 2, we did this kind of like types of studies exercise where we looked at them according to these different parameters. So considering the study that we're looking at for today, what are our thoughts about any of these kind of categories here, whichever ones you may be most familiar with? That applies to this. That would apply to this one.
And you can take some time to think about it.
Oh, I'm
Yeah.
sorry. I just threw it out.
If you don't need time, you don't have to think.
Okay, so qualitative.
In some ways, I kind of thought this was like exploratory because when I first started reading it, I was like, how do you get people to like admit they plagiarize and like start to explore what happens with that? So I thought in some ways that was kind of a new way to look at that problem.
Sure, so an existing problem, but maybe a little bit of a different take on it. And that last one, like we had discussed before, can be a little bit hard to read. Other thoughts? Yeah, but this last one, I was curious if y'all had any strong opinions about exploratory versus descriptive. So if we think about it kind of along a continuum between things that we don't know anything about the subject on the exploratory side versus really trying to pin very known things down and explain causal relationships on the explanatory side. I kind of saw things a little bit in the middle with the descriptive. So we knew a little bit about plagiarism already, and there were some categories that they had already explored. But the researcher definitely found a bit of a new take on it and challenged some of those preconceived notions that the research had.
I also think that the author came in with so much background knowledge about this. It felt like they had already established this kind of like feeling of people who, well, just like I guess in their work as were they a librarian who, it feels like they talked to these students a lot about, like they had to talk to them about their plagiarism maybe in class if they were a teacher.
I think I had read it, I don't know if y'all remember if they were a faculty
They were
member.
a
Yeah.
teacher, okay. They actually had like confronted, yeah, like they had this background with it.
And then getting outside of the framework in the middle, kind of going through a thoughts, questions, epiphanies exercise. So thoughts are just general impressions about like what you saw in the study. Questions are things that maybe were left a little uncertain that you want to see or hear a little bit more naturally as we go. So what were just general impressions of the study?
I thought it was interesting them kind of looking back at their experience with the K through 12. I know they talked about the issue of recall a little bit, how people had a harder time recalling their academic experiences in elementary school. I think that the whole, I guess, idea of plagiarism and some of the things that impact that, having roots in these like early childhood experiences is a little hard to measure, especially when you're using that as maybe part of your baseline. But yeah, I don't know. That was one of my general impressions.
That was definitely interesting, the way that they tried to link it a little bit to the K through 12. And they had seen kind of like stronger recall, like you were mentioning, on the high school end of things versus
I overall thought that it was well organized, structured very thoughtfully. They gave a lot of attention to various different elements that I think go into making a strong research into strong research.
And does anyone want to speak a little bit more about like what some of those elements were that you saw in the methodology that made you feel a certain way about it?
Yeah, I was exactly going to point to that and just say that I think that this author was very conscious of all the elements that go behind making specific choices during research. Like this could have had an effect to this point, or this could have been causing this. So it felt very thoughtful.
One of the things I did want to point out that we wanted to highlight was the fact that this was set up with the Sage Publishing as a case study. And so if you weren't aware, there is actually a full published article aside from this that is a little bit more traditionally how we think of research articles being published. So this one that we read was actually put forward with a specific highlight on the methodology for people to learn from. It took us a little bit of digging to actually find those side by side. So there's definitely, a grounded reason why they had that thorough explanation. Anything else that worked well or didn't work well, or questions that you were still left with, things that might have been left out?
This could have just been like something that I didn't like read, but I was a little unclear. It's like, did they like intentionally try to identify like first generation college students, or was that just like coincidental that all but one of their subjects was a first generation college student?
Any thoughts on that?
I think part of it was that they were trying to get historically underrepresented college students, which I think was like part of their, I don't know if it was clearly explained, but it was like, that was what I got from this first generation fit, especially because this author seemed to have a very strong opinion about that, or very, like this background again came into play where a lot of people they taught were first generation.
So maybe some questions about exactly how they selected those, or if it was just coincidental.
I also liked how they talked about getting the sample and the issues in getting it in this sort of like really, I guess, fragile topic based on whether or not a student would want to come forward. But I liked when they talked about thinking about approaching students that they knew who would plagiarize, how they were cognizant of the fact that they might feel like they had to, or like they were being, I guess, bribed into doing it. So I did like how the author kind of discussed some of those things as well.
The acknowledgement of the power dynamics there and the different things that students may be sensitive to, they were very cognizant of some of the things that we think about with power dynamics and
One thing that stood out to me in that regard was their emphasis on establishing rapport by asking the questions geared towards figures and towards the end. I thought that was definitely a strength.
Any other general thoughts before we move on? So we're gonna do conversations and have fewer people than we anticipated. So probably 2 groups of 4. And to expect a little bit to have some good So let's start with these line. 1, 2, 3. Oh my God, sorry. 1.
How we did it last week.
1, 2. 1.
What?
2. 1, 2. And so if you do 1's on this side, 2's on this side.
2's over.
Stay.
You're cute. Yeah, I forgot for a second too.
I'm just gonna stand.
You gonna stand? I think I want to stand too.
Okay, maybe we'll just be sitting group. I just don't like to sit.
Yeah, I know. I've been sitting all morning. It's up to you though. If you want to sit, it's chair. It's totally, yeah, I don't want to make. Yeah, don't feel like it's just like 8 a.m. Okay. So we have 3 questions to discuss. Let's be honest question, and we're gonna swap a couple people between each. Okay. You think the ways in which strength felt fitted her methodology, for example, the language choices, memorize and interview questions, and
Yes, bad results.
oh, that's right. You're right. Yeah, like instead of saying plagiarized, they say like copied or something like that.
And also, just so there's some context, she actually memorized her interview guide because she felt like having papers in front of her.
But only for the first one, right? For the others, she had papers.
This is one that. Sometimes, yeah. So
yeah, that's what I
for the particular
yeah.
question, she wanted to establish rapport. She decided to be less formal with the details and memorize her interview guide, and then she introduced papers later when more in depth. So how do you think that might have impacted?
You know, this, right. Thank you.
Yeah, that makes it.
I think it definitely impacted.
Yeah, people a little bit.
And their trust levels. Yeah. I think like the more how you go, we can get better like answers and conclusions from that because it's such a sensitive topic. Like our interviewers trust you.
Does it sound bad?
Same thing. You're gonna like actually learn more.
Right.
So I think the way that like it was tailored more on it.
Yeah, and didn't they do I know when they reworked the way that they were gonna do it, when they initially had sample, they initially sent out email, and then there was a phone call.
Then they added the cards. They're like, we didn't get enough.
Yeah.
So we need, we're gonna do a little bribing. Yeah. But you know, you can
Yeah.
And I think the one thing that I didn't like mark these areas, but I just remember that I liked how much they brought it up, discussed it within this paper. It was like, so I noted that I myself said I like changed my wording from like, and if I had not put plagiarized in the first email, maybe I would have gotten more people at the beginning.
Yeah.
So in that acknowledgement, I think that we all noticed in this, like I mean, how did it affect your reviews? It's hard to say when you don't have the
Exactly. I think about the other way around too. Like, how do you think not doing those things maybe would have changed?
More people would have dropped out.
Yeah. And then like, what are you accusing?
Later drop off.
And
right.
I mean, it's a pretty big risk too, because I feel like, you know, if you were to admit this and then be brought on a court, you could potentially lose your place in school.
Totally.
Yeah.
And then there was like this emotional category that she addressed too, very much like I brought tissues in my bag just in case because so
not traumatic experience.
yeah, that I really felt was a really nice kind of reminder, like this is something, these are people who have real feelings about this.
Yeah.
But this, maybe she wouldn't have gotten an emotional response if she hadn't changed her language.
And I think it was pretty telling to hear that, and it talks about, I think only 2 people said it was unintentional versus intentional. So the fact that they got that many people to say that it was intentional, I don't know, kind of points to me that they were truthful in their responses, or at least that approach it. That there were other things that impacted why they did this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How does their willingness to designate not just plagiarism, but
If she doesn't like.
yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Good job.
We like the
That's funny. I haven't heard of because you can have them building, right?
Yeah.
Probably, I think 2 people can just group to swap over.
So yeah, sometimes it's switch out.
We're switching.
2 people
Yeah,
per
I'm
group.
so like
Conversations like we've done before.
Oh, thank you.
Whoa.
Yeah, that was weird.
We're doing
Yeah, when we went to
standing on
Disney
the
World for the honeymoon, this was the only baby visit or online thing that they had.
All right. Okay, cool.
All right. Question 2.
Very good.
Compare and contrast with
No,
the
wait.
Indian study. What similarities and differences do you see?
Yeah, so as a reminder, that's the BDSM study where they did the which I was leading that discussion facilitation, so I do remember. So we looked at that across like a perspective, had like now. Yeah, any
Yeah.
you guys got like one story. You did the other one.
And there was like,
I mean, that's the
this
first
was
thing
a
I thought
faculty member and they're saying like the power dynamic is different.
positioning.
Like they're not a peer who happens to be saying like someone
Like,
who's saying to better understand things or because of
but their position within taxation, and how here.
Yes.
Like took much more.
Yeah.
And I was involved with approaching conversation, but it's still like structured. Whereas with Harvey,
She went further all that
same. It was too loose.
really good for it.
Like there was really no structure.
Making sure that everyone knew
And it
what we
was too
were
casual.
fitting into it,
Like
right?
it was
And
dishonest to
say that in Harvey's study. Like they didn't even know they were like doing. I think that. Really.
I also thought that at least the methodologies were pointed out here. They knew that they were doing like, or they explained why they did a semi-structured interview process instead of a fully structured, or why they chose an interview process. Like that whole
They are like.
research design was explained, which was obviously not explained at all.
But I think that
Our
still did a
Finnish
very good job of
sadomasochists.
overcoming that challenge.
This interview viewer is very
Like
after every aspect.
their questions and
That's why.
obviously he didn't write anything down when he was doing these.
Yeah.
Deceptive.
Yeah, there's a difference
But like
between, I
you
guess,
trying to
like
establish a
he in the last article was part of the population as opposed to this person not being a part of the population. It's a contrast, so you can't compare them in that way. It's a consideration.
And I feel like it would have been maybe like but I don't really know. Yeah, it just seems kind of comparing the two.
Yeah.
And I think that there are.
Yeah, but I guess in thinking about her being in her, he was a part of the population, so in a sense could feel maybe open us a bit more. Not that his results mean anything because we don't really know what happened. But this came from maybe more like she came from more of an authoritarian position onto this like population that was, you know, her I don't know how to say it, but like she was the professor
Students.
Yeah.
Yes, so.
I definitely
Yeah.
see that difference, but I think that it's like better ultimately that she did in this perspective than he did for with the population, because in his case, I think that it's like brags abuse of his position.
They both have dealt with very like personal issues, and it's just
Like his position in the population may have resulted in more open and like honest answers, but
trying
he
to open
wasn't
up with
honest with them about, the fact that
Yeah.
that these were,
That's interesting.
that he was gonna be busy with research. So
Take different avenues as a legislation.
Yeah.
One's like a deceptive trust.
the other one's like a we're not gonna get out of school kind of trust.
Yeah.
So like I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm doing it anyway.
They are the best.
I know,
The way they felt.
Yeah.
all right, we're gonna swap one more time.
Not the same
Time for us.
people.
Yeah.
Time for us.
Try and get a unique third
Yes.
configuration.
The original.
Oh, it is?
Yeah.
There we go.
Are we gonna be back to the original?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you were in my group, weren't you?
No, you weren't. Those other-
We're all in such a small room, it feels like we've all been doing. We've all been doing this close quarter.
It's just like.
Oh, okay.
It's all.
Jill, I got different
Last
Would you have felt comfortable participating in this study yourself? Why or why not?
I got $20.
I think that it would.
I don't-
think that
So not
for me knowing what the study would look like.
I would
and
I would trust her. I would like
but
not participate
like
in this study.
reading this,
But if I had
they're
to,
obviously very.
I would feel comfortable. Like there were so many ethical guidelines set up, and she was so like clear about like you can stop time and all of that.
I think we stop and
Yeah. Keep my favorite part is key. So I think I would feel comfortable doing it, but necessarily like want to kind of be like
I think in
being
some
asked
ways,
questions
when
about
you've done
plagiarize.
something,
So
when it comes to like academics, of like building
but
relationships
it's
with
still
like
like
any
a
faculty member,
interrogation.
like, knows
I
about
feel
you,
like
but like also
spot.
screams like not
So
judging for it.
you know, I think
So, like,
that's
still
her
build
hardest
relationships
obstacle
regardless
of
of
overcoming with people like coming to the study is like it
That-
can feel
that's
like
my
an
one
interrogation,
problem.
not
The study, not like a problem,
Yeah.
but just like
I think
for you, a student.
I would
telling
have
someone
been
who could
comfortable
be
in
professor
the
of
interview
yours,
stage,
or
but I
someone
would
in one of
not.
your classes, like, I have done this
Um,
before. I don't know if I would ever feel
Like if
comfortable
I fit
being in
in,
their class
you know,
later on.
Yeah.
Just because myself being like, I know
I don't think
that
that I
you
would
know
have signed up.
my
for it.
past, and I've cried in a room with
But
you for
if I had
$20
signed
on
up
an
for
Amazon
it.
gift card.
right.
I'm a little, yeah,
I think that's
like
the
the only thing.
probably one of her obstacles is like people
just
who
really
would feel comfortable
Yeah, at all.
doing
Yeah.
this study
Or
or people who don't meet that criteria.
Yeah, exactly. So
I don't feel like having
Yeah.
there's
I would
people
do
who
this.
like
Like if I were a biology student, this is like a in the
who like
whatever
really
studies department, like maybe
comfortable or
people
don't
never
like
come to contact.
if they had to do it, they would
Or if you
not
had like
be
more time away from it.
wanting to answer
Or even dealt with plagiarizing.
Yeah.
Like,
but I mean I
I like
think
the
that
way
she
you
as a like,
put
researcher
it's
really
hard
did. She tried a lot of different ways to make a very trusting and
Yeah.
safe environment. I agree. That's why I would feel comfortable doing it. Like if I had to do it.
There was a
Okay. I'm not gonna die because I
there
do
was a
this. My
while
whole
I
life
used
is
it
going to be
for
ruined.
mention, like nature, like this is
Mhm.
so that's kind of shielding up from that.
talk about the player rights thing
Mhm.
at first. Me, I think it's not to communicate with you
Mhm.
at first, and be able to maybe feel comfortable and to know the reason that's the research
Depends on how long it is a, you know, time
and then at
cost too. Like if I have to meet up with you twice, to get this $20, but probably not.
should say that the
Yeah,
Yes.
I did think about that when when I read that, I was like, so what if I came in and said, I'm not answering any of this? Like, give me my money. Give me my money. Start. I was like, she had to throw that out, but I could get my gift card.
Myself.
Yeah, but that also builds trust. At least this person learned anything, they learned how. So the university may give you $20, like they said they would.
It's kind of like.
Yeah. Right. And any question everyone that day, would you? I know that the plagiarism.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't either. That's really.
All right. That rounds out our discussion. So I was typing up this slide, eavesdropping on your conversations while you were talking, and we found a lot of really awesome themes that we wanted to kind of debrief as a whole class. So first of all, we talked about maybe the study is more descriptive, qualitative. It's not really generalizable to the population. There's no confidence intervals, anything like that. It's a small sample that's just trying to gain some initial insight and maybe describe a phenomenon that's already been described among a group of people that have done the study. And then one thing I heard a lot in the first question was there was a really thoughtful structure of how the interview was structured itself, like establishing rapport with non-plagiarism related questions, and then going into the plagiarism questions. The group felt maybe they had a positive impact on establishing trust and the honesty of the responses. And the researcher was very conscious of ethical considerations, and that may have had a positive impact on participation and establishing trust with subjects that she interviewed. And in terms of the pivots of initially memorizing her interview guide for the less structured interviews at the beginning and changing the language of plagiarism to maybe not cited text or something like that, it facilitated participation, trust, honesty, and we felt that maybe it was well justified too. She really explained why she did these things, and it was clear and it made sense. In terms of comparing it to good old Harvey Einen, so some similarities that you identified was it was structurally similar in terms of the way that the study was. It was interviews. This one was more structured than Harvey Einen. Structured, but it was structurally similar. They both had kind of backgrounds with the populations they were interviewing. So Harvey Einen was a member of the community who was interviewing in, and this researcher was a professor who had experience with plagiarism in student populations. And those populations both were stigmatized in a sense in terms of participating could be a risk for these populations in studies like this. But the reasons that you thought Strangford improved on this methodology is it was more structured. So the interviews had structure. They weren't just casual. She actually wrote stuff down. It was just overall like a more well-designed study. She was more honest. Harvey Einen obviously did not disclose to people that he was interviewing them, really, recording their conversations, things like that. But Strangford was very intentional and honest with what she was doing. And that made a difference in terms of just integrity and ethical considerations for a lot more well thought out. And then that brings to the next point. There was a lot of clarity in the ethical guidelines of the study. There was a lot of communication about things like confidentiality and participation is voluntary, and we're not here to get you in trouble, things like that. We're not going to report you. And she really tried to make it clear to the population that she was not in this to penalize them or, identify them in any way that could have been damaging. But a theme in your conversations was that although you felt like this may have facilitated trust among the people who had already signed up for the interview, it might not have been enough to convince someone to actually participate at the outset, which I think is a valid point. So these are the general themes I was hearing from all of you, which I thought were great and that I agree with completely. Is there anything from your discussions that you want to add to that?
The epiphanies, things come into the conversation happen.
I just really like appreciate how like comparing it with Harvey and I can't just that she, you know, they both were trying to establish like trust with the people they were interviewing. But they went about it very different ways. And one way just gave it felt like the results were more like pure in a way. And that there is some like ethical guidelines that were followed whereas the BDSM research there really weren't any. So I just think it's interesting to see how like researchers can take very different ways of trying to get to the same point, and which ways are more effective and which ways are less
I didn't think about it until right this moment, but I think strength was also in the United States. So, versus, I know the discussion of the Harvey and whatever, talked about, Finland maybe having some different procedures for how they like IRB removing.
Yeah.
I thought y'all made great points. Thank you for the great discussion.
And we'll have these posted as well in the PowerPoint so you can come back to it to reflect.
Good job.
Those are really interesting.
Thank you. That's kind of good. I was like,
it made a good comparison with Harvey and
right, it did.
Yeah, that was very different.
very
different. Okay, awesome. All right, we don't have a lot more to talk about, but I do want to, as I mentioned before the break, sometimes I feel like you learn more about how to do things well by watching a bad example. We don't watch a bad example. And I'm not picking on this poor woman because the title of this video is Demo Qualitative Interview with Mistakes. So it was meant to be bad. We're going to watch it. What I would like you to do, like it's cringy, it's really bad. Everybody should know at least a dozen things that this poor woman does badly. So afterwards, what I'm going to do is we're just going to go around and I'd like everybody to say one thing they noticed that could be improved. So I would say write down a bunch, especially once we get toward the end of the room, whichever direction we go. If someone has said all of yours, then you can repeat one. But let's try to come up with as many as possible. So you can write them down, or you can try to remember them. It's only a few minutes long, so it won't be. You won't have to endure it for very long. Is that good? I agree. I'm not sure about the volume.
Hey, my name is Allison Jones. I understand that you've been to several CHART trainings, and I am the qualitative interviewer. And so I'm interviewing people and asking them for feedback about the training and how all of that. So is it okay if I talk to you about that? Yes, that's great. So what is your name? Shay Boomer. Okay, profession? I'm a nurse. Great. And how long have you been a nurse? I've been a nurse for 12 years. Okay. Did you enjoy the training? Yes, I did. Would you say that you enjoyed it a little bit, a medium amount, or a lot? I enjoyed it a lot. Great. Okay. And did you learn something by the training? Yes, I did. Excellent. Okay. And would you recommend it to a friend? Yes, I would. Great. Okay. So can you give me an example of something you learned? For example, some people have learned that they may think that they're not discriminating and that they're very open and respectful of everybody, but then when they actually get down to it and they go through the training and they understand that there are things that they but they actually do have some sort of biases. They may not have known it, and the training helps them discover it, and then just helps them be very self-reflective. Do you think that maybe that's something that you learned in the training?
Certainly, I think some of that was covered in the training. We also learned about taking sexual history, effectively taking a sexual history, which is a sensitive topic, and it's not something that was trained in professional education. We also learned about patient confidentiality and the importance of maintaining patient confidentiality and protect our patients, and both of those I think were very relevant.
I'm sorry, can you just say that last part again? I got distracted. I'm so sorry.
Oh, it's okay. I believe I was talking about, we talked about the importance of patient confidentiality and maintaining confidentiality of patient records to protect our patients.
You've been talking a lot about what you learned, and now I'd like to ask you a little bit about what you've done differently. It's one thing to say you learned something, but then it can be quite another thing to actually try to do something differently. So can you tell me anything that you may have done differently because of the training?
So what are you doing differently since the training?
There must be something that you did differently. I mean, think about it, you know, anything, because you mentioned these different things that you learned about. So can you think about, you know, maybe keeping your voice softer or spending a longer time with patients or being more empathetic than you were before, anything like that? Do you think any of those may be things that you did differently?
Yes, I'm sure they must have been.
Great. Okay. So let's talk about the training methodology. Do you think it was effective?
Yes, it was.
Great. And how was it effective?
Well, it was a very interesting. I was happy to be there.
Great, but it helps you learn and do your work differently?
Well, perhaps.
Then I'm a little bit confused because it seems that you're contradicting yourself. I think earlier you said that it helped you learn and you were doing something differently, but now you seem to be changing your mind. And so now I'm just very confused. Can you clarify for me whether you did something differently because you learned from the training or you didn't?
Well, what I mean to say is that I think that I've always done my job well, and I like my job. I think that I've always been respectful of my patients, but I think that there are certainly some things that I'm doing a bit better.
Great. Okay. Great. Thank you. So that's all really good. Thanks. So would you like us to provide you with more training on this or any other topic?
Well, yes, actually, there are a number of different trainings that we offer from my facility that I personally like to attend. I am very interested in the health administration course that's offered in Washington, D.C. At Howard University. I'm also very interested in having some in-depth training on diabetes, which of course is a concern for us. I am also interested in taking some further training in care of pregnant women who are HIV positive. So there are, I think, a number of things.
Can you just say that again? I didn't get that last part.
Pregnant women who are HIV positive.
Okay. So what are some of the other problems at your facilities?
Well, one of the concerns that we've been going on administration was some of the water issues in the examination rooms. The running water isn't working in some exam rooms, which limits the number of rooms in the certain procedures. Water's not running. There's not. So that's one issue. The water's not working in a number of the exam rooms. I think there's also some communication issues, some systems issues between the pharmacy folks and the wards. And I think that it would be useful for the hospital if we were able to have some communication issues resolved between the pharmacy and the ward.
Okay, great. I think it's about time for us to wrap up. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
No, I don't think so. May I answer all your questions sufficiently?
Yes, just great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Oh boy, okay. All right, we're gonna start in the back. Brandon, can you tell me one thing you noticed that was bad? She could have done better.
She was distracted.
She was distracted throughout. All right, Zenon?
I remember there are some questions that are overlap. Like I remember the interviewers asked said that she had some she don't have some different okay.
It's okay. The questions were overlapping, like some of them were not very well worded.
Yeah,
Yeah.
There are some. I remember there are two questions that the interviewer said the girl are not answer in the same way. Right?
Yes.
Before is not friendly, and the after one is different. I not remember very clearly, but I think that's two questions. But it is there there are some content that's overlap.
Yeah, so the questions were poorly worded in a lot of places, and then she was trying to recall, like connect back to other questions and claiming that the person had changed their answer.
Yeah.
Was that the part that you're talking about?
Yeah, and she forced the girl to answer in a way that she wants to hear.
Yes, definitely. Forced her to answer in a way that she wants to hear versus what the person's actual opinion is. Definitely. Yep. Yeah, Mary Ann.
So I think overall throughout the thing, she was encouraging positive responses. So anytime she would answer positively, she would give a great or like, wonderful to that response, which I think kind of led her to answer in a positive way, especially at the beginning.
Yeah, so priming your interviewee to answer in a particular way that you want to hear.
Body language. When they're sitting really close, her hands are kind of flailing.
Yeah,
she's just kind of aggressive.
Yeah, gestures. So many gestures. Yeah, all the time in a very small space. Yeah.
I just feel her attitude is really annoying.
Yeah.
And then I remember she said, I'm confused. You are conflicting with yourself. She began judging the interviews.
Yeah,
like
rude, judgy, almost combative at times. Like it's a fight rather than conversation. Yeah, definitely.
Like providing too many examples when she would like finally give an open-ended question. She's like, well, it could be this, it could be this, it could be this. Do you agree with that?
Sure.
Yeah. That was good.
Yeah, so taking an open-ended question and then interjecting a bunch of possible responses rather than just reading. Fun. Yeah.
She didn't give the interviewer like time to think or respond at all. Like
Yeah.
as soon as she asked the question and there was some moment of hesitation, she jumped in with an example or something. It's like she was afraid of like the interviewer actually having an opinion.
Yeah, or afraid of silence.
Right.
No wait time at all. It's, here's the question, rapid fire, and I want an answer now. Yeah, Jillian.
She just seemed pretty complacent about the interviewee's responses, and she was only there really to get what she wanted, but didn't like she clearly checked out when she asked for suggestions and wasn't taking notes because she just was in it for her own gain.
Yeah, very unclear what, if anything, she was writing down substantively from that interaction or even paying attention to.
That's exactly what I was gonna say, that there was, I know this is a demo, but it still makes you think that you're not, like, there's no writing down that comes with this interview. It's all gonna be referenced back in memory. And nothing to go back to at the end.
Yes. Yeah. She made some like assumptions about the interviewee of like when she was asking her like, what have you done differently since the training? Like that the training has like that she was doing something wrong before the training, and that the training is what made her, it like affected her so greatly. She's doing something differently.
where she might have been doing like everything perfectly fine before the training. She just took part of the training because that was required, and then like for all employees, and then like just continued doing what she was before because it followed the guidelines of the training.
And that's a great connection to what we talked about last week with writing good survey questions. All of that guidance still applies here. That question had a hidden assumption behind it that she is doing something different. And she tried to explain, like, I already think I was doing a good job, but maybe it didn't. And the person just didn't even seem interested in like the nuance there at all. Yeah, Jane.
I think even the way that she started and set up the interview, she said, I am the interviewer. There was no discussion or disclosure at the beginning about what the purpose was or how she was going to be using it, or, you know, that she was free to not participate. I mean, she asked, you know, is it all right if I talk with you? But at that point, like, to say no when you're already there, like the person might have felt pressured to even start the interview.
Awesome. These are all great. Anything that wasn't shared that you had noted? I think you caught most of them. I would say too that she wasn't paying attention to the interviewee's body language, which at times looked very uncomfortable. And she was leaning back in her chair, and her eyes got wide. At some points, she looked kind of sad or even scared. And there was no indication that that woman noticed or cared about any of that. Any of it. It's really bad. Now, part of the reason that so I have done a lot of interviews, and I've been interviewed. Right. Here we go. I've been interviewed, but I've also been the interviewer in a lot of studies, and it's really hard. It's like, oh, you're just asking people questions, but it's so much more than that. To do it well requires a lot of skill. It's kind of just like every other method that we've talked about in this class, that they seem easy on the surface, but when you actually think about what it takes to be a good interviewer, it takes a lot of practice, and it takes a lot of interpersonal skills. It's easy to say like, oh, you know, just listen and don't look at your phone, and you know, you should be writing down everything they're saying. But even if that's what you're trying to do, right, you're still trying to juggle a lot of things at once. You've got a recorder going, probably. You need to every few minutes check in and make sure that the recording is still working. I've had that happen where the recorder loses battery midway through an interview. So you do sometimes need to look away from your person writing. You probably are going to be taking some sort of notes, which again requires you to lose eye contact with your participants sometimes. You are trying to focus on like the overall time, how much time is left, have I gotten to the important questions that I need to ask so you're able to answer my research questions. There is a lot going on cognitively for you as the interviewer, and it is not just a normal conversation. It makes it way harder to really listen to your interviewee, which is your number one task. That's what you should be doing. But there is a lot going on that makes that really challenging. The other thing that can come into interviews, and this is speaking from personal experience, is interpersonal anxiety on both people's part. So I have social anxiety. I am diagnosed on meds for it. I did my first round of interviews before I knew I had social anxiety. And then I had to listen to the recordings of myself talking, and it was, I mean, like tears. I cried. It was terrible, like awful experience. I'm never going to do this again. I didn't realize I said so much, and I phrased that stupidly, and she said this, and I didn't listen to it, and it's just bad. It was bad in the moment, and it was bad after. And then if your interviewees have anxiety, then you also need to think about that, because it can be really intimidating to go in a quiet room with one person and just talk to that person for an hour. Some people would find that fun, and some people would find that absolutely terrifying. So there's a lot of levels of things going on that you have to manage as an interviewer. So some common errors, I think all of which you saw in that last video, asking questions that are too ambiguous or too abstract, posing questions that imply one right answer, or posing too many questions in a row that are closed, and then it can seem like this rapid fire, you're just throwing questions at them. You saw some of that at the beginning of that video. Is what was your name? How long have you worked here? Very quick. Those questions. Framing questions that fail to allow interviewees to think through and answer. Not giving the interviewees enough time to respond. Not listening is in all caps because I think a lot of these kind of fall under that one. Not listening can lead to failure to follow up on important or interesting strands. And this happens too. You'll be listening to your interview recording after you've done it, and you're like, oh, I wish I followed up on that because they said something really interesting there and I didn't ask them to elaborate, or I don't know what that means now. And so if you're not giving them your full attention at that moment, it's difficult to be able to do that. Erroneously restating the interviewee's response. So she did that a couple times too. Or introducing too much variation between interviews. If your goal is, I'm going to ask everybody the same questions and kind of compare and see how they answer, then you want to be asking them the same questions, ideally, and not completely unstructured. Just, oh, I'm going to change the words here or asking. Some of that can happen naturally and will happen naturally, but you don't want each interview to be completely different because then it's really hard to answer your research questions. All of that, not doing that, takes a lot of time and training. So I'm going to show you not the whole thing because a good interview is a lot longer. So this is take 2. This is a better example. It's still not perfect, but it's much better. I'm just going to show you the first couple minutes and then I'll skip to the last couple minutes so you can see how she sets it up. Maybe 1 or 2 questions that she asks and the difference in how she closes them and listens. And then I'll skip to the end so you can see how she closes the interview.
Hello, my name is Allison Jones. I understand that you've taken a series of training workshops. I'm doing qualitative evaluations about the training so we can learn more about how participants think about their training and what they've learned. So I'd like to ask you about your experience with the chart trainings. Is that okay? Yes. Great. Can you tell me your name, please? My name is Shay Bloomer. Shay Bloomer. Okay. Can I call you Shay? Yes. Okay, thank you. And Shay, what do you do for a living? What's your profession? I'm a nurse. You're a nurse. How long have you been nursing? I've been a nurse for 12 years. Oh, interesting. So first I'd like to start out and just kind of get your immediate reaction to the training, the memories of how it felt to be in the training. What was your favorite part of the training and your least favorite part of the training?
I would say that my favorite part of the training was that the facilitators really took time to have discussions with us. And it was a very open kind of discussion that we had about a number of the topics that we were discussing. And I felt like I wasn't just being told things. It wasn't a one-way sort of experience. We were very much learning from one another, and it was exciting to be in a group with my peers and to be able to discuss the issues that we confront every day and learn different ways of approaching them.
Mm-hmm. I know that training was a while ago, but I'm wondering if in these conversations that you were having with facilitators and with some of your colleagues, can you remember any particular topic that was especially interesting for you?
Well, one of the topics that we talked about was taking sexual histories. And then, as nurses who are working in HIV care and in testing,
if we just kind of think within the realm of a day or maybe training by distance, do you have ideas about whether that would be enough for these types of topics that you've mentioned, the administrative management piece, for example, diabetes?
Well, the administration training that I know of is a longer training program. But the diabetes training can probably be addressed for short times.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for answering all these questions. It's been really helpful. Before we end, I was just wondering if there was any other feedback you'd like to provide about the training.
Just that I really appreciated it, and it was really useful training. And I hope that you'll keep me in mind for future training.
Great. Thank you so much, Shay. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Okay, so what was better about that one? Yeah.
There was a lot more please and thank you. Gave a level of comfort, and I want you to be here, and I want to listen to this.
Yeah, so basic manners.
Yes.
Jillian.
It wasn't nearly as rushed, so it had just a general, much more calm feel to it.
Yeah, she actually spoke much slower. Even as she was asking some of the same questions, she posed them. She spoke much slower and in a slightly lower volume. So it slowed down the whole process. She provided wait time. She could actually do food.
There's a lot more of like eye contact and engagement with the interviewee. Like even when she was reaching back to get a pencil, she like maintained eye contact.
Yeah, lots more eye contact. I've had some people think it was too much eye contact. I mean, like, and this is another example where you can't, there's no such thing as a perfect study, right?
Sure.
What works for some and others, but definitely I would say improvement over the last one where there was no eye contact.
And she was like looking for a phone.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, just clearly distracted. At least this one, it was clear her attention was on the interview.
She's referring back to previous parts of the interview to build on, different topics to show that she was listening.
Yeah, so she was looking back and she said, oh, these previous trainings that you mentioned, for example, the blah, 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 so showing that she was listening, giving the person again a chance to respond. Yeah, definitely. It was still a little bit tight quarters, and I'm guessing that was just maybe for the filming purposes. I would say, especially with the table right there behind you, it's much more common in an interview that you would be sitting kind of across from each other. That's up to you and your comfort where you are. I've done interviews. Do them at Sills. There's a room all the way at the top of the stacks, which is not a great location, but it's a decent room. It's quiet, and it has a table and chairs. Nothing else in there. But I've also done interviews out at like libraries. I've done interviews in Starbucks, and there's pros and cons to that too. So if you go somewhere like a Starbucks, it can lessen that power differential a little bit. It can be a little bit less intimidating for your interviewee. But there's also obviously a lot more distraction. It's harder to get a good audio recording, and there's less privacy. So if you're asking about anything that's sort of sensitive or might cause emotional responses, like the strength article that we read, you probably do want a private place where you're not going to be heard. Any other comments on that? So I also have an example of a folk. I'm so sick of politics right now. It just makes me like, and this was filmed before the 2016 election during that primary cycle. So just know that we're going to show up. You may not care to see on the screen Friday morning, but it is the best example. I looked for an hour last week to see if there was a better one that I could replace this with, but this one does have a lot that we can talk about. So I'll show it anyway, just a little content warning. So this is a humorous example of a focus group, but I think it will allow us a lot of things to talk about. So what I want you to think about is some of the things. What is the dynamic like between the kids and Jimmy Kimmel and among the kids themselves? What are some things that you think Jimmy Kimmel does well as a facilitator and maybe not so well as a facilitator? And then anything else you notice that might be relevant to our discussion.
No, there are so many presidential polls coming out all the time, literally every day. It can be overwhelming. So I decided to sit down to poll a group that we rarely get to hear from, and that's kids. Kids have opinions on politics too, and this is what they had to say about the long run for president of the United States. Hello there.
Hello.
Hi, what's your name? Hi, Edie, I'm Jimmy. What's your name?
Kaori.
Kaori, nice to meet you. What's your name?
Kind.
Hi, and hello. Your name? Nev. Hello, Nev. I'm Jimmy. Welcome. This is a focus group. Do you guys know what a focus group is?
No idea.
Edie, what is a focus group?
it's like a group where you try to focus on you.
Kind of, mostly true. Now, have you been following the race for president? You have. Well, what I was kind of hoping to speak about today is people that are running for president. Now, you know who's running for president?
A lady.
A lady, okay, that is true. Actually, there are a couple of ladies that are running for president. I'll show you their pictures if you want to see it. One of them is this lady. You know who that is? Yes.
Rose.
No, not Rose. Her husband used to be the president. Yes, he.
Is it Martha Washington?
You guys know Martha Washington?
Yes.
You know, her husband used to be president. What was his name? Yes, he.
George Washington.
Okay, hold on 1 second. I just want to say this. I think no, that's Hillary Clinton. Have you ever heard of her?
Yes. Yes.
What have you heard about her? Yes, Edie.
I heard she's very nice.
Where'd you hear that?
I saw it on the video.
You saw it on a video? Yes, Kyan.
I heard she was very, caring.
Sharing. Oh, where did you hear that?
On the news.
On the news? Not Fox News though, right? Hillary?
I feel like she's an old lady almost.
How old do you think she is?
I think she's 91.
98. Now, what age do you think the president should be?
Oh, I know.
What?
Abraham Lincoln should be like
How old is he now?
he's in heaven. He's
What happened? Oh my God, no.
I
I didn't see this on the news. Wait a minute. When did this happen?
Okay, did you guys know?
When?
He died from age.
From what?
He died from age.
Age.
He died, yeah. No, because he thought, he didn't like people treating the, people not good because those were slaves. So he had to stop it.
You're exactly right. All right, let's see what else we got here. Who is this guy? You know Edie?
George Clooney.
Oh, wow. Very happy to hear you say that. This is Bobby Jindal.
Scottish, is he Scottish?
He is Scottish. What do you think of this one?
Oh, I know.
Who?
Barack Obama.
No.
Barack Obama has dark skin like Steven.
Yeah, this is not Barack Obama. How about this guy?
I know.
Yes.
He looks like Barack Obama.
Barack Obama?
He looks like me, and he looks like.
This guy is a doctor.
Is he you? Are you a doctor?
I'm not a, well, yes, I am a doctor.
What doctor are you then? Optometrist.
One of the top, top optometrists.
Then what do optometrists do?
Well, they look at your top and they make sure you're What about this guy?
His lips are
Do you
perfect.
trust?
Oh.
All right, here's one more. This is, you know
Maybe
what?
Scott.
No, it's not. Good guess.
Oh, I don't want him to be president because he looks very old and he looks like this year he's gonna die. He's like exactly the same. He's smart and he still knows stuff and he reads books.
You think he's smart? Because he's wearing glasses?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think he's smart, almost like you.
Almost. No one is as smart as I am. I mean, ask me any question and I know the answer.
Oh, do you know what 0 plus 0?
Of course, it's 100.
No, 0 plus 0 is 0.
Not really.
No.
What's
the highest number?
Oh, it's 40.
No.
Yes, yeah.
How do you spell poop?
How do you spell poop? P-U-P.
No.
Anything else? Anyone have it? Yes, Kyan.
What's 0 to 100?
0 to 100 is a range of numbers. Yes.
No.
Anybody else? Any questions? Yes, Edie.
Did you ever go to Alaska?
Many times. I discovered Alaska. Yes. Not a question. Yes.
Did you go on outer space?
Yes, I've been to space, been to the moon, been to Mars twice. Loved it.
What?
Never.
Have you ever melted your head off?
Never. But I will tell you something. Sometimes my brain gets so hot from thinking, I feel like I might know.
Yeah, I think right now.
Will you guys vote for president?
Yes.
When?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow?
Hey, just
Who will you vote for as president?
The
Yeah.
guy that said we're gonna stop fighting and start doing our best.
I don't know who that is, but yes, okay, yes. Hi.
I vote to the same guy.
Same guy. Nev,
Yeah.
thank you.
I think the pen should be.
You think the pen should be our next president? Anybody want to take any of these pictures hopefully in the room? Okay, there you go, guys. Enjoy. Remember, folks, children are our future. Right, guys? I am Tina Kimmel. Are you sad that the video was open? Hi, Edie.
Okay, so obviously a silly example. But what were some things that you noticed that as a facilitator he did well?
I think he did be okay, get soliciting responses from them and getting them to emote or say okay. Thought.
Yeah, I would agree, especially towards the beginning. He would also follow on an answer that they gave him, follow up and ask another question, just try to get more out of them about it. Yes, yeah, and one thing that I like, well, I'll wait and see if someone else says that. So anyone's answer. Yeah.
He's pretty deadpan, so obviously it's supposed to be funny, but it doesn't, him asking the question might be a silly question, but it doesn't lead to a specific response.
Yes, yeah, and that's more or less what I was going to say. And also when they volunteer a response that's silly, he doesn't laugh at them or belittle them or make fun of their response. For the most part, he does it a couple times toward the end, but it evolves in general toward the end. But even when they say a very silly response, he's like, yes, okay, next. He's sort of accepted. And anything else that you feel like he did well? Remember what he did right at the beginning? Yeah, he shook each kid's hand, said their name, introduced himself, explained a little bit about why they were there, albeit in a silly way. And there was obviously some editing done, but that was all good. The introduction was good. All right, what are some things that could be improved, Jade?
He called on the one on the left constantly, and the one on the right he just kept ignoring.
Yes, yeah, a little bit Evie there with Edie, I don't know. She was definitely the leader. She had the most time to talk. And she also kept raising her hand. The others didn't even do that. So what could he have done to equalize the participation better?
Maybe just called on them in some kind of order to make sure they all had a chance to speak.
Yeah, so
direct the question directly at a certain child.
Definitely. So say, Nev, for this question I want you to answer first. What is blah blah blah? Yeah, definitely. Or we're gonna start at the end of this end of the table this time. Make sure that you get to every person, maybe change up the order. Sure, there's lots of different strategies. It didn't even seem like he was aware that was happening to the extent that it was happening. Because it was almost every question was right on it. Just saying. Yeah, not always with the best reason. And that tends to happen a lot, right? Often the person that volunteers first or fastest and repeatedly is not always going to have the highest quality responses. So providing some wait time, calling on someone else first, saying, I'm not going to take any responses for 30 seconds. I'm going to give you some time to think about it, and then I'll take the responses. Any of the strategies, there's so many strategies you can use to try to prevent that. What else? Any other problems that you noticed? Did you see any evidence of groupthink? So groupthink in a focus group is when one person will say something and then everyone else will agree with it. Yeah.
There was at one point, it's probably Edie who said, I don't know, who are you gonna vote for president? And she was like, the nicest person or whatever. And then I think it was Kyan also said, that same person.
Yeah.
You know, it's like maybe he had his own answer but forgot it or was like, oh, I'll just use that.
Yeah, and had they called on him first, it probably would have been a different answer for sure. So that's a danger in any focus group. I would say, having done focus groups with
not this young kids, but I've done focus groups with middle school kids. I think it's especially a danger for kids that age, and even more so when they know each other coming in to the focus group, because they're bringing in all of those social interactions. And like middle school, it's like there's very clear groupings and social hierarchies and things, and that doesn't leave when you walk into the focus group door. So there was, a leader, and there were questions that were asked, and everyone would look to that person. But you have to be very careful about that. Some of those same strategies that we just talked about earlier in terms of alternating who goes first or giving people wait time can also help to prevent that. Asking people to write down their responses before they share them can also help, because then they've got it in front of them. And even if they don't feel comfortable saying it to you, maybe you can take that paper at the end and see what their unfiltered response was. Anything else that you noticed from this video that you wanted to talk about? So focus groups, they have a lot of advantages. You can get this really interesting interaction between the subjects. There's less of a power imbalance, but definitely very challenging to facilitate. When I've done it before, I've been fortunate and had, every time I've had at least 2 researchers in the room, and it's usually one person will actually facilitate and talk, whereas the other person will take notes and or manage the recording, so you can kind of help manage it better that way. Recordings are also really hard with focus groups because you don't know who's saying what when you listen back to it. So if that's important, this is maybe not the best method to use if you want to be able to attribute specific things to specific people. Okay, so just to summarize, we're almost done, I promise. With interviews and focus group studies, the things that you can do to try to make them better are a lot of the things that we've noted in other studies that have used this method. It's not the first one, like Harvey and Inls interviews. We've talked about some of this. Actually publishing your questions that you use is called an interview guide or a focus group guide. Including the actual text of the questions can help people understand. Describing your methods carefully, including things like where the interviews took place, how long they were, how you selected participants, if there was anything important about the mode. So like, did the interview over, like the last week that we did, some of the interviews were done over chat instead of face-to-face, and they mentioned that, transparent about it. Taking notes during or immediately after the interview, and those notes can be things that the person is saying, but also if you're having a recording, maybe that's not really what you're trying to write down. Maybe instead you're asking yourself questions or making notes about things that you were unsure of, like, oh, I'm not sure what she really said there. I was confused, check the transcript. Your feelings, this part of the interview is really awkward, or the person started crying here, right? Those are things you're not necessarily going to hear in the recording if you go back and listen. And anything about the process that might be important to remember later, like maybe took place in a private room, or it was really loud, and halfway through we had to leave because the fire alarm went off, or whatever, anything like that happened. Carefully select and describe the people that you're interviewing. Ideally with an interview, since your sample size is probably going to be small, you want to get a selection of people that have different opinions about your topic, or who are likely to say different things. If you have 5 people and they all say exactly the same thing, you're probably not going to get a lot of depth to whatever research question that you're exploring. Back up your findings with quotes. This is something we've talked about a lot in this class. It's not enough just to say, oh, my interviewee said this, but if you can illustrate that with a raw data quote, it's going to lend more credibility to your findings. Similarly, you want to record and transcribe exactly what they're saying if you can, not just your summary note after the fact. And I'll just throw this out as a caveat again. You're not going to know when you read a published report if that interview was more like the first example that we watched or the second. No one's going to say in their interviewers, I'm a really awkward person who uses terrible gestures and is rude to my participant. So you're not going to know that. It's another place where you kind of have to take a little bit on faith. But I will say that at least if you're doing interviews, you can do better than that. It's really bad.
Okay, so next week is one of my favorite topics, content analysis. I think it's really fun. It tends to be a love it or hate it type method. So for the lab, which is due Wednesday, I know a couple of you have already submitted it. This should not take you long. You're just going to be asked to code 20 images of scientists from kids' picture books. There's nothing to actually turn in Sakai. It's just a Google form. So you're going to code your images on there, and once you hit submit, then you're done with the lab. It is due on Wednesday, so keep that in mind. And again, that's so that I can compile the results, and we're going to discuss them and figure out reliability stuff in class next Friday. I think that is all. So, Lydia and Chris did want me to tell you that the article that they're discussing next week is about Black Lives Matter, and it's the content analysis of tweets related to that. I think they're going to send out a more detailed content warning, but I did want to also just verbally warn you that it is an article about police brutality, specifically police brutality against unarmed Black men. So just keep that in mind. If you don't feel comfortable reading it or don't want to participate in the discussion, just let me know. We can work something out. All right, awesome. Have a good weekend.